Reading Kiskeya and Kanaka together, Dominican and Hawaiian Indigeneity in English language texts. Decoloniality as a political and epistemological framework and project is engaged by both indigenous as well as Afro-descendant and mestizo activists and scholars throughout Abya, the region commonly called Latin America. It is also used by Native Hawaiian authors. A decolonial feminism calls attention to language, including a move away from colonial languages such as English and Spanish. Native Hawaiian author and activist Haunani K. Trask states, "One way to decolonize is to recover your own metaphors, the language that is the language of the place from whence you come." So for authors and scholars of indigenous heritage, literature in English or in Spanish is often infused with indigenous words like Kanaka Maoli and Kiskeya, and with indigenous concepts, landscapes, and experiences. Along with Haiti and Bohio, Kiskeya is one of the 3 indigenous words for our island in the Caribbean Sea, on which the current countries of Haiti and Dominican Republic reside. Dominican activists have embraced this term as a way to both solidify commonalities with Haitians and to acknowledge our indigenous heritage as a decolonial move. But in the context of contemporary literature in English, Kiskeya is not a well-known term, even as Dominican writers such as Julia Alvarez, Juno Diaz, and Elizabeth Acevedo have become nationally recognized for their authorship. What happens if we read Dominican American writings as rather literature of the people of Kiskeya, of modern Tainas, Tainos, and Tainx? One result can be a shift in the literatures we compare our writings to. We can read Kiskeya literature alongside the literature of Kanaka Maoli, Native Hawaiians, recognizing the treatment of indigenous history and decolonial literary and pedagogical strategies in the literature. Specifically, I will focus on Marianela Medrano's books, Diosas de la Yuca and Rooting, pairing them with Haunani K. Trask's Light in the Crevice Never Seen, Anesi Baez's My Daughter's Eyes, and pair Raquel Cepeda's Bird of Paradise with Alan Robert Akana's The Volcano is Our Home. Ochi Curiel's history and summary of decolonial feminism points to its multiple tenets and approaches. Colonialism is a system of economic and social oppression that continues to this day in places that have ostensibly stopped being official colonies of European countries, but that have not really decolonized. Feminist standpoint methodology combines with the epistemic privilege of the oppressed, breaking with the othering that occurs when academics study people marginalized by colonialism. Instead, we speak for ourselves and study ourselves. Decolonial feminism gives a platform for indigenous and Afro-descendant womanist imaginaries, the people and the ideas that colonialism sought to completely suppress. Decolonial feminism seeks different pedagogical processes and a close relationship between thinking and doing, favoring thinking that comes from doing. The work and works of Kiskeyan and Kanaka Maoli authors are very well aligned with these tenets. Marianela Medrano began her career as a writer in the Dominican Republic in the 1980s, but has written and published most of her works while living in various towns and cities in Connecticut, USA. She has mostly authored poetry, most of it in Spanish. Her works include the books Oficio de Vivir, 1986, and Los Alegres Ojos de la Tristeza, 1987, written and published in the Dominican Republic. Regando Esencias, The Scent of Waiting, 1998, published in New York. Curada de Espantos, 2002, and Diosas de la Yuca, 2011, written in the US but published through a feminist publisher in Spain, Ediciones Terremosa. Prietica, 2013, a children's storybook also published in Spain, and Rooting 2017, a bilingual Spanish-English book of selected poems and translations. She is published in many journals, anthologies, online venues, and newspapers. In 2015, she was one of the 2 honored writers of the Dominican Book Fair of New York, Feria del Libro Dominicano en Nueva York. In an interview, Marinela Medrano speaks about her early childhood in the countryside in the northwest of the Dominican Republic, and how in everyday play she would come across Taino artifacts in the dirt. She grew up hearing Taino stories, such as the stories of La Ciguapa. However, her education did not reflect these personal experiences and the reality of many who lived similar circumstances in the Dominican Republic. Many of the poems in Haunani K. Trask's book, Light in the Crevice Never Seen, can be read as Native Hawaiian history lessons. A good number of them, followed by explanatory prose that clarifies the historical and sociological allusions. Similarly, Medrano's poems in Diosas de la Yuca engage historical events and the trauma of colonialism, although instead of explanations following the poems, many of Medrano's poems begin with a quote from colonial-era documents, such as the writings of Fray Ramon Pané or of Christopher Columbus himself. Medrano's poem of How We Learn to Play Hide and Seek begins with a quote in which Columbus had written that in order to gain the trust of Taino people and convert them to Catholicism, he would give them worthless things. The poem, written in the first person plural, speaks for the Taínos as a people and indicates that we, the Taínos, seem to succumb, but that on the contrary, we actually fly. Black hair only pretends its disappearance, but later comes out for air, blessed by the divine force of the deity Ochun. In this way, Medrano acknowledges our African heritage in addition to our Taino heritage, breaking away from the romanticism of the 19th century indigenous Latin American movements that elevated the indigenous in our history while negating or ignoring our African heritage. The poem also references Taino deities. In the roots of the yucca, the goddesses and the gods keep on making miracles for us. It does not end with the colonizing moment, but brings us into the present. The deity Caguama protects us even in these days of beaches colonized by tourists. This message of the Taino being a force that can help us with present challenges and propel us into the future is echoed by Christopher McGrath's reading and his assertion that, quote, Diosas de la Yuca goes beyond any utopian project or attempt at building a national myth to explore Taína spirituality, rooting it in the immediacy of individual Dominican experience. The indigenous in Medrano's poetry is proposed as a living force and a key cultural element in which the Dominican can shape his or her subjectivity and thus resist and overcome the divisions and erasures caused by the original trauma of the Spanish conquest and the current experience of living simultaneously in the here and there of diaspora. End quote. Both Trask and Medrano use their poetry to tell their indigenous histories to their own people as well as to others on the outside. They both published their books in the countries of their respective colonizers, the USA and Spain, both via feminist presses. And they both have confronted the racism within white feminist movements of those countries. A decolonial feminist reading of Dominican history and archaeology has brought out many reasons for us to reject the myth of Taino extinction. Archaeologist Kathleen Deegan has found considerable evidence that Taino cultural practices were maintained much beyond the years in which Tainos supposedly suffered complete collapse, and that the misrecognition and telling of this history comes from the neglect of women's roles in society on the island post-European invasion. Historical anthropologist Lynn Guitar found that although many Taíno women had children of Spanish men, these children were considered Spanish by the official birth documents, not Taínos. And in this way, a genocide by paper occurred that erased their Taíno identity in historical documentation to this day. This is perhaps a precursor to a practice by USA colonizers in Hawaii, in which, quote, indigenous people are easily assimilable into white culture through intermarriage and dilution of blood, while maintaining white as superior, end quote. However, the assimilation is often only superficial, and in Kiskeya, even as official documented identity and the official religion of the Spanish were adopted, Guitar and Deegan found evidence that, quote, inside their homes, in the domestic sphere, the Taínas' lives and those of their children remained very Taíno. What they ate, how it was stored and prepared, child-raising practices, home medicinal and religious practices, storytelling, the importance of song, music, dance, and naming patterns, even the concept of who is family, all have remained overwhelmingly Taíno in the Dominican Republic to the present day. The problem seems to be that as a people, Dominicans don't really know just how Taíno we are. We don't have the language for that. We have been taught that somehow being Taíno is part of our past, but not of our present or of our future. It was while canoeing on the Naugatuck River in Connecticut that Marianela Medrano had the inspiration to write about Taína spirituality, one of the many instances in her life in which nature was a place of creation. She had been struggling with a topic for her dissertation in psychology. Another similarity between her and Haunani K. Trask is that they both have PhDs. While out on the river, Medrano was overtaken by a feeling of connection to her indigenous roots and started to sing the name of a Nakaona, a Taína chief well known both on the island as well as throughout the Caribbean for attempting to protect her Taíno people and negotiate terms with the Spanish invaders, and for being betrayed and killed by them. When Medrano went home, she immediately started to write a series of poems, and her dissertation and her emerging poetry book became very intertwined. Taíno culture is not just an academic or literary pursuit for Medrano, who would like all Dominicans to consider how Taíno culture is with us all the time. She told one interviewer, "A Nakaona found me. It turned out that the topic was the encounter with the goddesses of Taíno culture. How, if I brought a group of women to get close to the goddess in the Taíno cosmology, what impact would that have on their perceptions of themselves? Every day I would process. I would write poems, and that's how Diosas de la Yuca came to be. It is a conversation with what the colonial chroniclers told, a focus that tries to restore many of the things that had been lost in the way they had been told. The question of the approach of the divine feminine within Taíno cosmology was something that was said, but simply left there. Therefore, if you ask a typical Dominican, let's say, or anyone, I think even the most lettered, might very well be unable to name any of the goddesses. So what I think Diosas de la Yuca has come to do is to bring back those elements that had been left behind in the archival folders, no, of official history. Even to think of Taínos as part of our own past, something we can claim as our own history, is not always acceptable for Dominicans. Dominicans often talk about the Taínos in the third person as an extinct people. It was in Anesi Baez's book, My Daughter's Eyes, that I myself first noticed a Dominican author speak of Taínos as our ancestor, rather than, as is common, a distant people who just happened to live on the island years before us, with no real connection to us. Unlike Medrano, Baez in her book does not evoke nature so much as urban landscapes, with the setting mostly in the Bronx, New York City. Yet within that urban setting, By the simple use of the phrase our ancestor, Baez suggests the conclusion: if the Taínos are our ancestors, then we are their descendants, then we are also Taínos and Taínas. Raquel Cepeda also encourages Dominicans to accept our indigenous identity. Her memoir narrates direct conversations with scholars such as Lynn Guitar and Taino activists such as Jorge Esteves, as well as the experience of undertaking various kinds of DNA tests that indicate indigenous heritage. DNA testing as a method of validating indigenous identity is heavily critiqued by North American Indian communities. However, in the case of Taína, Taíno, Taínix identity, indigenous ancestry, the context is much different. DNA testing has become one way for my community to open their eyes and the eyes of the world and to question what has been called the myth of Taino extinction. Of particular note are the gender dynamics that are validated and uncovered via DNA testing. Cepeda highlights that all the initial DNA studies finding indigenous ancestry in the Dominican Republic and the rest of the Caribbean are mitochondrial, tracing direct maternal ancestry. This complements Lynn Guitar and Deegan's findings about the role of Taína women in passing down Taino heritage. By contrast to Raquel Cepeda, Alan Robert Akana's memoir, The Volcano is Our Home, has no need for DNA testing as a way to establish his indigenous heritage. He recounts for those of us not familiar with Native Hawaiian customs that it was a part of the indigenous culture to know and retell one's family genealogy going back many generations, a custom that continued throughout the centuries even after colonization. He writes, "My ancestors used their genealogies to construct concepts of time, serving as oral calendars and history books. Like Cepeda, he writes for his own people as well as for an outside audience. And, like Trask, Medrano, and Cepeda, he also infuses history lessons in his writing in a very compelling way." Through my reading of Marinela Medrano's poems, I not only began to accept my own Taína identity, but also turned to the documents of the historical record. Medrano's citations of Fray Ramon Pané led me to read his book. I was shocked to find on the very first page of Pané's text a cultural practice that I had always taken note of, but never thought of as a Taino practice. My parents were both immigrants from the countryside of the Cibao region of the Dominican Republic, and I spent considerable time there myself. Throughout my childhood and adolescence, I had often heard relatives talking about recently deceased people and commenting that they had seen them after their deaths while outside walking on a trail or in the local roads. So when I saw the words, "y creen que los muertos se les aparecen por los caminos cuando uno va solo," and they believe that the dead appear to them on the paths when one goes out alone, I felt a chill go through me because I recognized my family's experiences. I've learned that Taína applies to me and the people who raised me. We have a way to articulate that the things we do and did have this meaning. We have this language thanks to Marianela's poetry. Of course, language alone is not enough of a focus for decolonial outcomes. Trask noted that even though the Hawaiian language was banned by the USA in 1898, it was unbanned in 1978, not for a decolonial agenda, but for the sake of tourism. This is another way that decolonial feminism becomes powerful as a framework, since it does not privilege language and ideas over people and action. Consistent with decolonial feminism, these writers do not separate writing from actions. Trask acts in the realm of politics, Medrano and Baez in the realm of women's psychology and personal development and sense of identity. And both Cepeda and Akana use their narratives and insights to connect with real youth. Cepeda with a group of Latina girls in New York, and Akana with his own son. I hope that my contribution will have a direct influence on your understanding of Indigenous issues and also, for the sake of this conference, on pedagogy of English language and literature. Teaching these authors in conversation with each other provides a novel way to teach both contemporary English as well as the critique of English, contemporary Indigenous issues, as well as history of specific Indigenous people. Thank you.